Something I find incredibly fascinating about the world of shonen anime is that no matter the circumstances of release, the popularity or reception, it's a near universal experience amongst anime fans that shonen always take a while to really get going. It doesn't matter if you're one of the old school ones like Dragon Ball or JoJo, one of the big three like Naruto or Bleach, or even some of the shonen considered to be some of the most well written like One Piece, Hunter x Hunter, and in the case of what I'll be discussing today, Fullmetal Alchemist. This makes a whole lot of sense if you understand how stories are usually written. At the start of a narrative, it's usually a good idea to start small and give the audience time to get a good feel for the direction of the story, the characters in the world, so that the narrative hook that's intended to drag the audience into continuing takes a bit to really sink in, as the audience will be more receptive to it once they've got a good reason to feel they should be invested in the narrative. Shounen manga, of course, is no different in this regard. Sure, there is also the added element of shounen mangaka not entirely being certain what direction they'll be taking their stories in. See Akira Toriyama initially writing Dragon Ball as a comedy, or Eiichiro Oda planning One Piece for a 5-year run initially, but the plan is always to slowly engross the reader into the feel of the story before really hooking them. The reason I find it so fascinating is that it's such a universal experience amongst anime fans that rarely do people talk about their experiences getting into the story and how that might have affected their perception of the story. And if so, it's kept to a minimum in favor of the more interesting parts of the narrative. There's a lot of different anime that I feel showcase the dilemma, but today I want to discuss 2001's Fullmetal Alchemist, as I feel it presents perhaps the most interesting variation of the situation, of the first couple chapters or episodes being lesser than everything that came after it. Not only because of how it attempts to remedy this issue from the get-go, but also because of the effects this would have on its two anime adaptations, Fullmetal Alchemist and Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. This video's purpose is to discuss the first number of chapters of Fullmetal Alchemist, what I feel they did both correctly and incorrectly, and especially how Fullmetal Alchemist 2003, at least to me, fixed what to me was Fullmetal Alchemist's biggest weakness, these opening chapters. Something you don't want to do when opening your story is overloading your audience with too much information. You can get away with it, but most writers feel it's better to focus more on introducing and selling the audience on the main characters and the main focus of the narrative. In that respect, Fullmetal Alchemist is really good at keeping things simple. We're swiftly introduced to our main protagonists, Edward Elric and Alphonse Elric, and their eccentricities. Edward is a bit of a hothead, but also incredibly intelligent about something known as alchemy. He's got a cocky streak to him and is pretty outspoken about his beliefs, such as his disinterest and disregard for religion, for example, but in spite of these details, he shows that he is a very caring, understanding person. His little brother Alphonse initially feels more like a background element compared to his louder older brother, who he often has to keep in check, but it makes any moment that he gets focused stand out much more. He may be much more quiet than his brother, but he's shown to be much more outwardly kind-hearted, very intelligent in his own right, and much more physically capable than his brother. It's fascinating how his kind-heartedness is contrasted greatly by his very imposing design, which appears much less welcoming. These chapters, firstly, are here to give us a good feel for these characters. As I discussed in my previous Fullmetal Alchemist video, characterization, or at least the way your characters interact with their surroundings, is a major part of getting audiences interested in your characters, and this arc is all about that. Oh my god. Despite how serious some sequences in this mini-arc may be, the story always finds ways to have the brothers showcase their personalities, particularly Ed's playfulness and Alphonse's maturity and compassion. These chapters do also make it a point to drip feed us information regarding their past, enough to get the audience interested in learning more about it, with a particular emphasis on Ed's disdain for the idea of bringing somebody back to life, something which the audience is soon to understand he's very familiar with. Not only that, I commend Arakawa for contrasting the, as far as the audience is aware, horrific tragedy of their backstory with their present personalities, which appear much more bright and upbeat in spite of that. I think it further grabs audience attention in gravitating them towards learning more about the brothers. The actual narrative of these chapters is pretty straightforward. The Elrics end up in a town known as Lior, where the people surround a priest who is able to perform miracles. The Elrics start to investigate him on suspicion of possessing a Philosopher's Stone, an item which is capable of breaking the laws of what the duo refer to as alchemy. Alchemy is the power system of the narrative, and Arakawa does a fantastic job giving the audience a good idea of how it works. You use material from one thing to create something out of that. I really respect that in the grand world of shonen, where new manga are in an arms race to create the most insanely complex power systems known to man, Fullmetal Alchemist keeps it as simple as it can be, while also still finding ways to be complex in its own right. But what I really respect about this first chapter is that it knows to keep itself simple, but simple in a way where everyone can understand how it works. Immediately it establishes that something like a broken radio can be fixed pretty easily with alchemy, but only because all the pieces of said radio were there. So when a Philosopher's Stone is brought into the equation and is capable of easily bypassing the only rule of the system, it instantly creates a sense of intrigue. Anyways, due to the Elric snooping, they eventually come into conflict with the priest and those who work under him, as the priest turns out to be a corrupt man who is indeed using a philosopher's stone to do fake miracles and gather followers to his cause. That being said, the heart and soul of this narrative is Rose Thomas, a young woman who is a devout follower of the priest who was convinced by said priest that he can bring her dead lover back to life. Rose is a narrative tool to help establish the characters of Ed and Al. Ed is quick to chastise the idea that a human can be brought back to life and is also critical of religion in general. Alphonse sympathizes with her and handles her clear grief with much more care. Rose acts as our third protagonist in this mini-arc. As Ed and Al's journey has just begun, she is the one who has to develop and go through an arc. That being said, she learns the hard lesson that nobody can be brought back to life, and that the only thing she can do is pick up the pieces to her life and keep moving. Ed's quote is such a great moment to really round out his character, and genuinely, this entire mini-arc does a great job establishing all of these super duper duper important details the audience very much must know. I think this is a great set of chapters that I feel do their absolute best to sell Fullmetal Alchemist to a 2001 audience. But in spite of how good this chapter is, I do feel it isn't quite enough to hook the reader. At least enough to sit the audience down and give them a reason to keep reading or watching. It's good at making it clear that Fullmetal Alchemist is nothing to sneeze at, but I also don't feel it's effective at making audiences universally interested in checking out those next couple of chapters, and unfortunately this is a pattern amongst those next set of chapters. Chapter 3 follows the Elric brothers getting crossed up in a conflict in a mining town. This chapter serves to give the audiences a good feel for the role of the Amestris military, who would go on to play a major role in this narrative. This was a very smart and honestly obvious move to make. As in the previous chapters, the fact that Ed was also officially a part of the military was a detail you might have been able to miss given the focus of the mini-arc was elsewhere. This arc quickly establishes the military's role in this world, and that the military is not a force for good, at least not inherently, and that Ed isn't afraid to bend the rules and do his own thing, even if he is employed by them, if he feels it is the right thing to do. Chapter 4 is about the Elrics foiling a terrorist attack on a train. This chapter serves as an expanded introduction to the military, particularly Roy Mustang and his squad, who Ed works directly under. Like with the first chapter, I find that both of these are incredibly fun individual chapters, but lack that pull. As I've been discussing with the early chapters of FMA, it's clear that while each chapter works well on its own, they don't necessarily create the momentum needed to pull readers deeper into the story. The early chapters offer interesting concepts and world building, but they lack a strong, unifying direction or a compelling hook that makes the reader eager to see what happens next. The narrative at this point hasn't fully established the depth of its cast or a clear sense of where the story is heading. We're introduced to the Elric brothers, but beyond their quest for the Philosopher's Stones, the stakes and overarching plot haven't fully come into focus. There's a feeling of, where is this going, that might not compel someone to keep turning the pages. Now, this isn't to say that a lack of direction is inherently a flaw. In an anime like, say, Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is much more subtle about the direction its overarching narrative is going in, sometimes a much slower, more episodic approach can work if the characters and world are strong enough to carry it. But in Fullmetal Alchemist, particularly in these early chapters, the characters haven't yet developed into figures the audience can fully invest in. The series hasn't provided enough of a reason for readers to care deeply about what happens next. I do feel Chapter 5 offers a great shakeup to the status quo. This is the infamous Nina Tucker chapter. Already this chapter sets itself apart from the ones that came before, focusing on a much more laid-back, less action-heavy situation where while dealing with some more menial stuff, particularly research, they end up befriending a little girl whose father's house they were doing research in. Compared to the loud, bombastic chapters we've seen up to this point, this is a much more down-to-earth and wholesome chapter, though again, given the way it's paced and presented, very straightforwardly and not particularly noteworthy. Of course, that being until the surprise ending. As I mentioned a moment ago, this chapter follows the Elric brothers as they spend time at the Tucker household in order to do some alchemy research. While doing said research, it's clear that Shao Tucker, an alchemist with a focus on chimeras, is in a desperate situation where if he doesn't pass his certification exams pretty soon, he might be out of the job. It's something that's happening in the background, but the audience might start to question where exactly it's heading. Either way, I doubt anyone who got their fill of those first 4 chapters was expecting Shao Tucker to turn his daughter into a chimera. Now, you'd think that given we were literally just introduced to Nina, this wouldn't be a moment that would hit particularly hard. We've had a little under a chapter to familiarize ourselves with her, but I think the emotional weight of this moment comes from the Elric's reaction. It stands in such stark contrast to the chapters prior where the Elrics always came out on top, forcing the Elrics to grapple with their weakness for the very first time in the story, ending with this poignant scene where Ed screams out to the sky that we're just human. The next chapter continues this dark streak, introducing us to Scar, a victim of what we learn was a genocide against his people, and in retaliation for said genocide he's going after state-sponsored alchemists, which includes Edward Elric. With their failure to protect Nita still fresh, the Elrics' failure to protect themselves from Scar is hard-hitting. What these two chapters very importantly do is change the dynamic for our protagonists. In those first 4 chapters, they're presented as almost untouchable, but in these two, we see them as physically and emotionally vulnerable, adding more depth to them as characters. Meanwhile, they also help further solidify more cast members. Prior chapters focused on one-off characters who were there to act as tool to further the narrative, but the Nina Tucker and Scar chapters spent a little more time acquaintancing us to Roy, Riza, and other military-adjacent characters. The Scar chapter also subtly introduces us to an important plot thread in the Ishvalan genocide, and with Scar still on the run, this acts as the second major plot thread, the other being the Philosopher's Stone hunt, used to pique audience intrigue. And one that at this point feels as if it has much more urgency, as the story hasn't really done too much with the build on the search for the stone, yet we've encountered Scar, know he's very powerful, and that he's still out there and will probably come for the Elrics again. So now the story's really building that foundation. Chapter 8 sees the Elrics heading back to their hometown of Risenvolt, but before they can do that, they run into a certain man named Dr. Tim Marco. The Philosopher's Stone hunt, the Elrics' driving motivation, had felt like a side element of the story for a couple chapters there, so this chapter serves to bring that back into focus. We're given much more plot details on the Ishvalan genocide, and most importantly, the Philosopher's Stone, with the Elrics being pushed in the direction of where they can possibly learn more about the stone. But we're also formally introduced to the first of what will become many major antagonists, Lust, who makes it a point to detail her entire plan to Marco and the audience. So now the story is really establishing a sense of direction for itself, and subtly pulling the audience in. But of course, there's still work to do, as this is only the beginning, and that's not quite enough to make someone consider sticking around for more. Even though the story is starting to shift into gear with chapters 9 and 10, I still feel there isn't a strong, compelling incentive for audiences to be completely hooked just yet. Chapter 9 is more of a breather, offering a laid-back introduction to the Rockbells and their connection to Ed and Al, along with some deeper insight into how Automel works. It's a necessary chapter for world building and character development, but it doesn't exactly create a sense of urgency or tension. Similarly, Chapter 10 pushes the narrative forward by reigniting the hunt for information about the Philosopher's Stone. While this chapter does do a good job pulling the audience back into the central plot, the stakes still don't feel as high as they should be. There's intrigue, yes, especially with the looming presence of antagonists like Lust, but the story hasn't yet given the readers that big moment that makes them desperate to see what happens next. The thing about stories is to truly get audience investment, you need 2 things. Strong character writing to get the audiences into said characters who you'll be revolving your plot around is a first. You definitely can get audiences into a story with that by itself, but a strong narrative through line is important in guaranteeing audience engagement. FMA spent a lot of time building the former while slowly investing into building the latter. And in Chapter 10, we finally gain our hook.
The main ingredient for a Philosopher's Stone is human life.
This reveal is followed swiftly by the Elric's intrusion and investigation into the 5th laboratory, which reveals more secrets about the government, and this is followed up by Maze Hugh's tragic and yet mysterious assassination, which makes it clear to the audience that the military has already been infiltrated by the antagonists. Each of these plot beats, I feel, provide that necessary hook to really get Fullmetal Alchemists rolling. I've always felt that Fullmetal Alchemist starts out slow but steadily builds momentum, eventually snowballing into this complex, large-scale narrative that it's celebrated for being. From this point onward, the story only continues to improve, quickly cementing its status as one of the all-time greats. While the revelations in Chapter 10 and beyond provide the crucial narrative hook, it's important to remember that the earlier chapters, while solid in their own right, still leave room for improvement. As I mentioned before, the initial chapters lacked a clear sense of direction and urgency, which could make it difficult for some readers to feel fully invested from the start. The character development was there, but the narrative didn't quite have the immediate pull needed to keep audiences eager for what comes next. This is what makes Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 so fascinating. The plan going into this adaptation was to come up with something original for the ending, as the manga was hardly out of its first act, as there was no way the anime wasn't going to catch up to the manga before long, and unless the staff wanted to spend at least 3 years doing filler episodes, that was a no-go option. However, for whatever reason it may be, the writing team behind the anime version also chose to make many sweeping adjustments to those first couple of chapters, and I'm talking very foundational changes that completely alter the intentions, themes, and dynamics of these chapters and how the audience is meant to interact with them. And if I'm gonna be honest, the decision to do something like this was the smartest thing this team ever did. The first two episodes are an adaptation of the first two chapters of the manga, making pretty small, subtle changes to the chapters, such as increasing the amount of screen time and interactions between the Elrics and Rose. In the manga version, the Elrics introduce themselves to a town at an outdoor eatery, which is where Rose drops by, and the owner of the establishment gives the Elrics and the audience a good rundown of her backstory. However, she doesn't interact with the Elrics much until they drop by the priest's church later in the chapter. In the anime version, this is where they meet and they actually follow her to the church, all the while she joyfully makes jokes about it being short. While Lus is present in the original chapters of this mini-arc, in the anime version we're introduced to her a lot earlier and have a little more screen time for her, making it clear that she has a lot of influence over the situation and putting that into the audience's mind much earlier. Finally, many more scenes were added across the episode that were not in the manga. For example, we're introduced to the older versions of the Elrics through Ed and Al having a comedy routine in the desert on their way to Lior, and when we get there, Ed finds that a fountain of what he thinks is water is actually a fountain of wine. Very unsubtle, Bones. The conflict between the Elrics and Priest Cornella's men is extended and even goes on into the night where the brothers are attacked once again and Ed finds himself captured. Though I do feel these specific changes were made more with the intent of making sure the runtime of these episodes covered the allotted 24 minutes each, as these chapters likely couldn't fit in that time without them. But it's in the third episode where things really get interesting. Instead of getting to work on an adaptation of the Mining Town chapter, instead the writing team pivots all the way to chapter 21. This chapter, and the ones that followed for a while, acted as a more thorough elaboration as to what the Elrics did in their past, and how they ended up getting involved with the military in the first place. It was pretty straightforward in its intentions. As I just said, it was there to elaborate on information the audience was already aware of, that the Elrics lost their mothers, spent time training with Azumi Curtis to hone their alchemy skills, attempted to use alchemy on their mother to bring her back to life, lost body parts, and joined the military to gain research on the Philosopher's Stone to go get said parts back. But by doing this, in the 2003 anime, this is the first time the audience is being made aware of most of this, and the sequence of events of the manga are elongated to add much more weight to the events. In the manga, we only get a page of screen time for the brother's mother before they establish she died. Something which wasn't done likely because everyone knew she died, so no need to dwell on that. The 2003 anime, however, makes sure to give her more screen time to really help the audience further understand why the Elrics did what they did. The Elrics' relationship with Winry is also expanded, such as when they perform alchemy to try to make her a gift and she freaks out, or how her parents' sudden death affects her and the Elrics. All of these details crescendo into the brothers doing the deed and failing, where a whole wave of mysteries are swept upon the audience, only to be briefly pushed aside as the horror of what has just happened is shown. But almost immediately, the writers get straight to work setting up the next number of episodes, establishing that Roy Mustang was made aware of the situation as it happened and became interested in recruiting the boys. So almost immediately, they get back on their feet and begin their journey of becoming state alchemists. Moving all of these details earlier into the story, despite that kind of going against the intentions of the manga version, was actually a pretty smart call because it pulls the audience deeper into the emotional core of the story right from the start. By presenting the tragic backstory of the Elrics earlier, the 2003 adaptation doesn't just elaborate on their past, it makes their motivations and struggles much more immediate and clear to the audience. By immediately following up this tragedy with Roy Mustang's intervention and the Elrics' decision to become state alchemists, the story quickly sets the stage for the central narrative, Ed and Al's quest to gain their bodies back. This early establishment of their goal and the things they've already faced makes the audience much more invested in seeing how they'll overcome the challenges ahead. It effectively hooks viewers by emphasizing the personal stakes for the Elrics and setting up a clear narrative drive that makes you want to stick around to see how they'll achieve their goal. Now, I'll come back to the filler episode that has nothing to do with the manga material that follows up this episode later, but after that episode, 2003 jumps straight into adapting the Train Terrace chapter. The chapter is reimagined as a testing grounds for the Elrics as Roy orders the boys onto the train and reveals at the end of the episode that in order to guarantee they could take the state alchemy exams, they needed to prove themselves as they are both 12 and 11 years old respectively. The goal of this section of the story is clear, getting the audiences invested by setting up a short-term goal in the state alchemy exams. In the manga, said exam was only a couple of pages, there was no real reason to dwell upon the exams there, and the focus was more so on the aftermath of said test where Roy is explaining the terms and conditions of his working relationship with the Elrics. The episode after this is mostly anime original but with a twist. It adapts bits and pieces of the Nina Tucker chapter, having the Elrics get involved with the family long before they would in the manga timeline. In this version, they stay with the Tucker family and use his vast library as a means of studying for the exams. It does a great job establishing the relationship between the Elrics and the Tuckers, building the tension of taking the state exams and finally paying it all off with a crescendo of emotions as Ed passes the test with flying colors. With the exams now over, we start a new arc, focusing on Ed's first escapades as a state alchemist. Unfortunately, things start out incredibly rough for him. First comes an adaptation of the rest of the Nina Tucker chapter. Then this is followed up by an anime original episode where Winry, who came by to visit, is kidnapped by a serial killer. What follows is a desperate struggle for survival as Ed, still reeling from the death of Nina, struggles to compose himself and fight against a serial killer who stalks him and Winry. This episode does two things. Firstly, in 2003, it's here that the story really establishes the Philosopher's Stone hunt, kicking into gear the following arc. However, it also helps showcase that in spite of everything, Ed is still a kid. These past two episodes have really gone far to showcase this aspect of Ed, from him passing out upon seeing one of victims of a murders, as it reminded him of his mom, to struggling to use any of his training at all against Barry the Chopper because he was completely stricken by fear. After all this, the anime finally adapts the third chapter of the manga, The Mining Town, in this version taking place as the Elrics are still adjusting to their jobs as state alchemists. That's the only real major difference between this version and the manga version, aside from an appearance by Lyra, who becomes an important character during the climax of 03. Otherwise, it's almost a beat-for-beat adaptation of the manga version. As such, I think both versions are good enough, but I feel that because in 2003, we've been loaded with all of this context as to what the Elrics have gone through and are still going through, I'm much more engaged in this version of the events, where this feels like a personal test for Ed to use his strengths to help after falling short multiple times so recently. It's because of that I feel the 2003 version, in spite of pretty much being the same as its manga counterpart, ends up being the superior version to me. It gets me more interested in the outcome of these events, and I feel that narrative through line is what carries me through a lot of early FMAO 3. The next 3 episodes are all filler that are not based upon material from the manga, and it's with that I'd like to fulfill my promise of discussing the 2003 episode that was in between the flashback episode and the train attack episode. Now, don't get me wrong, I do feel when it comes to discussions surrounding these episodes, the importance of them are highly exaggerated within the FMAO3 community. Any claims about it being integral to the themes or world building is hardly true, as aside from introducing us to the Tringham brothers, who play a somewhat decently important role during the climax of 2003, nothing of value happens in these episodes on a character development or writing level. We learn nothing new about the world of FMAO3 through these episodes, and the themes of these episodes are all things we see in the canon episodes too. But in spite of that, I never really minded these episodes, particularly 10, 11, and 12, and I feel the reason is because the audience is still coasting on the emotional momentum established in the earlier episodes. By this point, we've already been drawn deeply into the Elric's journey, invested in their struggles, their losses, and their determination to make things right. Even when the plot isn't advancing in a major way, the emotional weight of what we've seen so far keeps us engaged. Though it helps they're all solid episodes too, with great character interactions. But what I feel really makes this section really shine is that because the team behind 03 added so much weight behind the Elric's journey right as it was getting off the ground, there's already momentum going into the sections of the plot where things start really taking off when the mysteries begin to pile up. Episodes 13, 14, and 15 lay the groundwork for exploring the disturbing side of the Amestris military via information about the Ishvalan genocide. It's used to great effect to give Roy more depth as a character after all of his previous appearances up to this point has portrayed him as kind of, being a dick. Episodes 18 and 19 begin to adapt the 5th laboratory arc, though with some changes. Primarily that of all characters, Lieutenant Maria Ross is given much more focus. She's kind of an emotional support, looking out for the Elrics much more overtly than the other military members, and even pushing them in the right direction when things get tough after they realize the Philosopher's Stones are made up of human souls. It's in the 5th laboratory arc, though, that things get really interesting. In the manga, the 5th laboratory is pretty quick. Ed goes in, fights some souls-bonded armor guys, meets the homunculi, and after getting knocked out by Envy, that's it. In this version, however, the entire conflict is just entirely flipped on its head. In the manga, this is the part of the story that acts as the moment where it really gets going. In 2003, it's the end of the first act, the culmination of everything that came before. In this version, after Ed fights the armor guards, one of them takes Ed deeper into the lab where he's reunited with Shao Tucker, who's trying to recreate Nina. Alphonse journey into the lab himself in this version, joined by Scar, who was also interested in the situation surrounding the lab. The conflict with the homunculi is extended. In the manga, they show up, beat up Ed, kick him out before he could learn all the secrets of the 5th lab and the Philosopher's Stone. But in this version, they intend to lure him in so he can use an incomplete stone to transmutate into a true stone for their own deeds. It's at this moment in 2003 that everything that had been built up crescendos in this explosive mini-arc. And not only does it end with many more mysteries being opened up, it ends with a new direction being taken for the story. as aside from a couple plot threads, 2003's story entirely strays away from the manga's version of the events. Where 2003 succeeds is in taking everything that worked about those early chapters, the slow methodical world building and character writing intended to give the audiences a good feel for the story, while also front-loading them with enough reasons for them to want to see the main characters succeed, not just at their main goals, but at just anything. At least just long enough for the real plot to kick in, by which time the audience will have already been more than primed for what's going to be an amazing emotional journey. Those first 24 episodes of Fullmetal Alchemist, at least to me, act as one of my favorite stretches of any anime ever. Sadly, I feel the rest of the anime isn't quite up to that standard. Not because it's bad or anything, just that to me it's really hard to beat the duet that we had between Arakawa's writing and Studio Bones working off of that. By building on the foundation of that pre-existing material, Fullmetal Alchemist's introduction was elevated from, above average to honestly phenomenal. Which makes the outcome of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood's version of those same events rather curious. 2003's successor, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, is well known for, having a case of being a show that takes a moment to really get going. Since Brotherhood intends to be an incredibly straightforward adaptation of the manga, well, it sticks closely to Arakawa's version of those events. But what I find interesting about it is that that's also not true at the same time. While Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 makes a large number of adjustments to the events of the manga, so does Brotherhood, but in a very different way. For example, Brotherhood doesn't begin with Lior, it begins with a completely anime original episode that focuses on the Elrics and the rest of the main characters going after somebody known as the Freezing Alchemist. You remember way earlier in this video where I expressed that something you don't want to do when starting your story is overloading your audience with information? Well, Brotherhood doesn't take this advice. This episode front-loads you with so much information it feels like you're getting shoved through the gate. You're swiftly introduced to all sorts of different alchemy, a good chunk of the cast and all of their dynamics, a whole lot of lore, and a whole bunch of future plot points the audience should not be worrying about right now. I completely understand why Bones chose to do this. I did just spend a couple minutes detailing what I felt was a flaw in the manga's storytelling that could be corrected when it comes to retaining audience attention, so the Brotherhood team opted for a more exciting introduction that would introduce a number of concepts and lore bits so the audience could sink their teeth into it. A bit easier, I guess. Unfortunately, because the episode is doing so much at once, it doesn't really have enough time to explore any of these concepts in a way that can get audiences engaged. They have to do things like boiling every character down to basic archetypes, quickly jump through motivations, quickly drop important plot beats. Whatever intentions they might have had here, it was handled poorly, and I think this first episode suffers because of that. But things only get more strange heading into the next episode, which doesn't adapt the Lior story arc, but instead Chapter 21. Similar to that of 2003, Brotherhood quickly hops into the future with the intention of front-loading the audience with the emotional baggage of what the Elrics have gone through in order to get them immediately engaged with the Philosopher's Stone hunt. But whereas 2003 did a lot to adjust this in order to make a chapter that took place long after the audience would have already known and cared about the events that took place, such as giving Trisha more screen time, Brotherhood sticks incredibly closer to the manga, down to giving Trisha the most minimal of screen time. This was fine in the manga, but so early into the anime, it doesn't land. And Brotherhood could have theoretically rebounded by focusing much more on the aftermath of her death and how the brothers reacted to it, but the most we get is them sitting in front of her grave and later monologuing about how much they miss her. The rest of the episode quickly gets us through the events of the remaining flashback chapters, but I still feel Brotherhood carries over the manga's lack of clear direction at this stage of the story, and the intent to gain audience sympathy early on like in 03 falls completely short. The next episode adapts Lior in what is a pretty decent adaptation of these events. There are some cutscenes from the manga, but the episode mostly comes out fine. My biggest criticism is more so the flat direction leading to certain moments falling flat. Compare Ed revealing his arm in 03 to Brotherhood's version, but then it gets stranger. Instead of jumping straight to the Mining Town chapter, Brotherhood just straight up skips to the Nina Tucker chapter. In fact, it entirely ignores the Mining Town chapter, in spite of the fact that Yoki becomes such a major player in the story, and Brotherhood still introduces him as if you're supposed to be acquaintanced with the guy. Sure, there was a line of dialogue to establish he existed, but that's something you could easily forget about. Guilty as charged. In fact, the train chapter is skipped, and so are the bonus chapters involving Roy that became episode 13 of 03. Yeah, at this rate it's pretty well known that Brotherhood made it a point to skim through a lot of those early chapters in order to get to the knockout punch sequence of events involving the reveal of the truth behind the Philosopher's Stone, the fifth laboratory, and Hughes' death, which leads into further interesting segments that hadn't been covered in 2003. My analysis is probably one you've heard a billion times if you've ever listened in on FMA discussion at all, because everybody complains about that. But I kinda want to analyze the intentions behind Brotherhood's version and honestly give it a fair shake, as I do feel there's an element of bias and misinformation surrounding it that doesn't really take into account the rights and wrongs of Brotherhood's versions of these first couple episodes. I mean, already people blame the lack of audience interest in these first couple episodes on Brotherhood itself, instead of pointing out the fact that a lot of this is the manga's fault, as I've made clear throughout this entire video. I definitely do think Brotherhood could have done more to maybe make this segment a little more interesting, and I do think in many ways it did make that worse, but I don't think it's fair to entirely blame Brotherhood here. You know how it's commonly claimed that Fullmetal Alchemist cut out a lot of manga material to head straight into what hadn't been covered in 03? While I do believe there may be some truth to that, I don't think that's entirely true. I wouldn't be surprised if this is something that's outright incorrect, because mind you, I've never seen a source for this claim. It's just something that's accepted as fact, but I have my own theory here that I feel makes a little more sense. Though I also want to point out the fact that the assessment that Brotherhood cuts out a lot of material from the introduction segment, that definitely isn't incorrect. I've seen both anime, I've read the manga, I can confirm Brotherhood does cut out a lot of scenes and does cut out a couple chapters too. However, I've seen a lot of people question why Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood cut out things that were not in the manga, such as Nina Tucker's screen time in 03, the extended conflict in the fifth laboratory, the extended version of the State Alchemist exams. From Twitter to forums to YouTube videos, I've seen stuff like this everywhere, and I'm not gonna name names here, but I just don't get it, because some people are quick to criticize the supposedly faithful version of the manga for not covering these events that are not faithful to the manga. It's really counterintuitive and confusing. I feel the likely reason Brotherhood cuts what it does is because behind the scenes the plan was for Brotherhood to end around the same time the manga would, which was set to be around early mid-2010. With that timeline in mind, the production team likely felt the pressure to ensure the anime kept pace with the manga's progress. To achieve this, they needed to streamline certain parts of the story, trimming down or even skipping some sections to maintain momentum and align the pacing with the manga's concluding chapters. This approach allowed them to sync the manga's finale with theirs. Not just that, but mind you, I just spent a good chunk of this video criticizing the early sections of the manga and then glazing the 2003 version for fixing that. I feel there was an understanding that some adjustments could or should be made, primarily focusing on some of the more important and engaging events of the early story, instead of focusing on slow burn world building and character introduction. Given the military was already properly introduced in the first episode, no real need to keep the train attack chapter. Since the military's relationship with the populace isn't that important outside of their treatment of Siege Fallens, there was no real need to keep the mining town chapter. Sure, it introduced Yoki, but I mean, it's Yoki, it's really not the biggest loss. Not to suggest I think this was the greatest of ideas, I think the manga in 03 kind of run circles around the Brotherhood version of these events, but so many people quickly portray these choices as nonsensical and resulting in audiences missing key details when a lot of the stuff they're missing out on isn't really that important, and really, the choice to remove what chapters they did makes a lot of sense. But nonetheless, I do feel Brotherhood doesn't have that same oomph from the get-go 2003 does in its beginning, nor the charm of the manga version, which is a shame. But ultimately, for all the shit I've been giving Brotherhood this video, it's still my favorite version of all three. While 2003 slowly stagnates after it runs through all of the manga material that was out at the time, once Brotherhood makes it to the fifth laboratory section, the quality just keeps increasing. Back when I was giving both shows a rewatch with the aim of giving 03 a more fair shake, I was actually pretty confident my rewatch of 03 made me change my mind on which was better, but once I got into that stretch in between the Greed stuff and the Promised Day, once again Brotherhood proved to me that it's insanely strong narrative, well deserving of that title of one of the greatest anime ever made. But let's be honest, both are good, and you know, I think all discussion surrounding which one is better is purely subjective and doesn't need to be taken that seriously. Manga, 03, Brotherhood, it really does not matter. As these stories go along, they prove themselves to be some of the greatest narratives ever written, and I wouldn't have it any other way. You know, I really did not want to edit any more of this fucking video, but, you know, I wanted to prove I'm not a soulless husk of a person, and express my gratitude towards the support my channel has been receiving since my last FMA video came out last month. Very much surprised at the, I think 14K it has so far, and the just insane amount of support my channel has been receiving. Lots of positive comments, and for that video and my Hunter x Hunter video. And I just wanted to say, if you've seen that and you had something to say about that, good or bad, thank you. It's it's genuinely great being able to provide my own arguments for this discussion and have people listen. That's all really exciting. And I'm glad I've gotten a lot of people interested in what I'm doing, that they want to stick around and see what else I can do. It's crazy because if you know me personally, I'm not really the proudest of that video. I think I didn't do the best with my arguments. In fact, it's been keeping me up at night, and it's been distracting me from my schoolwork. I'll be doing schoolwork, and I'll be like, I think I did a really bad job on that FMA video. It's really kind of an issue. If you know me, I'm my own worst enemy, so it's no surprise that I'm not the biggest fan of that video. But, I still want to say, in spite of my issues, I'm grateful to see that there are people who do see a lot of value in that video and what I'm doing. So I just want to say to anybody who watched that video, thank you. I'm really grateful, and I hope you enjoyed this one too. I don't usually like asking for likes or subscribers. I'd rather the quality of my videos be the thing that get them to do that, not me telling them to. But I would be interested if you have anything to say about this video in the comment section. I'd love to hear it. Plus, it, helps with the algorithm, so, Otherwise, thank you for watching. Hope you all have a great night.